Good morning, everyone. I hope you had a lovely Easter weekend, and today we'll keep moving on with our topics. One general issue before we begin today's discussion. So this week we are beginning to address the last assignment that you have other than the final project, which is the last quiz number 3. So later today, I will send you a link to the questions of the survey, the questions, I'm sorry, of the quiz. So just like you had on quiz number 1, quiz number 2, this is based on the readings for week 13 next week, which revolves around terrorism. So the questions will be focused on that. You will have their list, as always, of questions. You're going to have to choose a number of those questions and answer them. And the deadline to submit this quiz is going to be next Sunday night. So next Sunday will be April 11th. That's going to be the deadline to submit the quiz right before I begin talking about it in our meetings. Okay, so be on the lookout for that as well. Let's put my screen here. There it is. Okay, so on our meeting last week, we talked about overall the topic for the week was deterrence and coercion and compellence. And on Wednesday, I talked primarily about the aspect of coercion using a military power and primarily aerial power. A lot of the studies that I talked focused on the efficacy of using aerial power in order to accomplish different political goals, the different types of strategies that are involved when it comes to applying aerial power to engage in coercive actions, either denial, which focuses on the military assets of the rival, or punishment, which focuses actually in the population, the importance of the types of demands that are presented to the target, and the more excessive demands reduce the likelihood that the target will acquiesce to our demands because the costs that they're imposing on them are much higher. Then we talked about the idea of the duration of conflicts when it comes to using aerial power, showing the difference between democracies and dictators. And then I talked in the final section of the lecture about the idea of using aerial power as a coercive tool against non-state actors. And the two examples I talked about were researchers that focus on Vietnam and the Russian actions in the North Caucasus. And overall, the general, I guess, conclusion we can talk about for those studies is that applying aerial power as a coercive tool against insurgents in most aspects is ineffective. It was effective in some cases when it was applied against mostly military type targets, but this is, as we said, from the context of insurgents, it's much harder to distinguish between the military target and civilians because the insurgents are incorporating or integrating themselves within the civilian population. So that was part of the problem. So overall, that was the main finding. If you have any questions about this topic, as always, office hours, Friday meetings, and email as ways to talk to me about that. Okay, this week we begin to talk about territorial disputes. First, we'll mention the concept of proximity and understand how the idea of proximity and contiguity matter to those types of interactions between states and primarily military conflicts. And the main research is going to guide our discussions for the first part of the lecture is going to be the work by Vasquez, which you had on your reading for today. And he's examining the role that neighboring states and the proximity between states matter for those kinds of disputes. So overall, when we look at the entire data about wars over the last 200 years or so, the vast majority of conflicts between states happened between neighboring states. Just we can look at this map, which shows us Europe after the Congress of Vienna, which was in 1815, the conclusion of the Napoleon Wars, and you can see the close proximity between different states, how many neighboring states have engaged in conflict during the earlier part of the 19th century and the latter part of the 19th century. We have here France, we have the different German federations, we have the Austrian Empire and the Russian Empire, all of them engaging in different types of conflict disputes and wars and different levels of wars during that time when they are neighbors, essentially. Now, one way to explain this phenomena, the fact that conflicts are more likely to emerge between neighbor states is based on realist logic. The idea is that neighbor states seek more power, right? That's realism. Countries seek more power, and neighbor states are more likely to clash because they're closer to one another. Now, a more advanced version of this argument is that more wars will emerge between neighboring states because it's harder for states to engage in long-distance wars, right? Long-distance wars. If now France wants to go to war in Russia or in, I don't know, Turkey or something, it requires both the capability as well as the opportunity. Now, because this is very hard to accomplish for long-distance war, it's easier to accomplish when it comes to closer distance, then wars between neighbors is more likely. Now, a lot of the research in the past showed that there is a strong relationship between territorial contiguity and the emergence of wars or any kinds of militarized disputes. For example, there's a very famous 1992 study about interstate wars, and that study assessed with data dyads of states and their likelihood of going into wars. What are the different factors that lead to that? And what that author showed that territorial contiguity is one of the most powerful predictors of going into wars. So there is evidence for that in the existing research. And one way that we want to talk about it now even further is to try to understand why does this territorial contiguity between states represent such an important predictor of going into wars. So one explanation can be primarily just proximity, like I mentioned earlier. The basic logic is that close proximity between states provide them with the opportunity to go to war as well as the willingness to go to war. Another version of this point is to revolve around what's called the loss of strength gradient, which means that it's harder for states to project their power, which parts of it is going to war, further away from their own territory, so wars between distant states is less likely. However, when we think about proximity and the role that territorial contiguity plays, the distance between wars, the distance, between states is constant, right? It does not change. Therefore, it cannot be a cause of war by itself, because if it's constant, it cannot change. How does this explain that in some cases we have wars, in some cases we do not have wars? So that means that distance by itself, proximity as a concept, only offers what's called an opportunity for conflict. It still does not explain what's the willingness in this case. Now, adding to that is that all the technological and military innovations over the last 100 and something years has reduced the limitations that distance plays in leading countries to wars. So wars between distant states is less of a problem because of all those kinds of innovation. So proximity can be viewed as an indicator of military strength. And once two states are in close proximity to one another, they have the opportunity to unleash all that military power and go to war. But again, once again, that only represents the opportunity aspects of the argument. It still does not show us why states are willing to go to war when all that we have as an explanation is the fact that they're close to one another. Now, a second explanation that Vasquez talks about is what's called interactions. And that's the idea that wars are a result of conflict of interest between states. An increase in the interactions between states reveal more disagreements between them, and using force in that sense, so going to a war, is one way to address those problems. However, looking at interactions as an explanation has a substantial flaw to it, because if you go back to the discussion that we had about political economy, we talked the fact that more interactions actually increase the probability that states will cooperate with one another. So how can interactions both explain more conflict, but at the same time also explain more cooperation? So from a liberal standpoint, more interactions increase cooperation. At the same time, the more tensions that states have, the more disagreements they will have less amount of interactions with one another because they have disputes over different issues, right? And those kinds of dyads that are close to one another are more likely to go to wars when they have less interactions. So all these discussions actually leads me to say, according to this point by Vasquez, is that more interactions does not necessarily provide us with an explanation why proximate states which have a territorial contiguity aspect between them will go to war. So the third explanation is the ones that he promotes most, and that's called territoriality. This explanation views wars as a decision by states to engage in violence when they are unable to solve a specific territorial disputes by using any other means. So if they cannot bargain for it, if they're gonna get to a negotiated solution, they decide to go to wars. Now, those issues become more important when it comes to territorial issues because a threat to territory becomes, in that sense, the willingness to fight. So as I said so far before, up until now, when I talked about proximity, proximity was the opportunity to go to war, right? But in order to explain, provide a more encompassing explanation why countries will go to war, they need the opportunity, proximity, they're close to one another, but they also need an incentive. They need to be willing to go to war. So when the issue is a territorial issue, there's a threat to my territory, that's going to be my incentive. That's going to be my willingness to go to war. So essentially what that means is that some types of disputes, primarily the ones that revolve around territory, making more lead to the fact that wars are going to mean much higher probability of an outcome when the issue at stake is a territorial issues. When there's other types of disagreements, other types of issues, such as economic disagreements, other types of political disagreements between states, then ending up with a war is a lower probability outcome in this case. Still, we need to talk a little bit more. Why do territories represent this type of issue that makes war more likely? And one way to think about that is that a territory represents space, food, resources that are vital for our own survival. There is research in biology which suggests that it makes sense that humans have learned or adopted the use of violence to address issues of territory. Essentially, what those studies are saying that when there is a threat to our territory, we have some form of instinctive reaction which involves violence to those kinds of scenarios. So it also has a biological underpinnings for that. Despite all those supportive arguments, Vasquez still says that territoriality by itself cannot be a cause of war. We need to combine the idea of the interaction between states that have to address those kinds of issues in order to explain why wars emerge. There is a territoriality issues between states, and they involve more in interacting with one another. They have to address that problem, and that increases the odds of war. Now, to test those kinds of arguments, he uses empirical data on wars between 1648 and 1949, and he breaks them down to different historical periods, showing that wars that revolve around territorial issues and disputes that involve around territorial issues were more likely to lead to war. So you see here, for example, during the vast majority of the 19th century, the early 20th century, a total of 84% of the cases of wars were revolved around territorial issues. Similarly, for the first half of the 20th century, about 93%, 80% of the total wars that took place in the second half of the 20th century. So once again, the implications, first of all, what he shows in this description of the data is that disputes based on territory were more likely to lead to war, to end in wars. Now, the implication of this discussion is what's viewed as the core of the territoriality explanation. Territorial issues are different from other political issues, and they're more likely to lead the two actors that are involved in that dispute to a violent conflict. And why does it matter that territorial issues are more important than other political issues? Because if we think about it in the context of policy, one argument can be if indeed we're able to show using a lot of research that territory is the single most contentious or dispute leading issues between states, especially neighboring states, that means that for policymakers, it has a lot of implications. They have to think about and design and place a lot more attention when they address those kinds of disputes between states. Okay. Okay, so we keep talking about now this idea of territory and the issue and territory as an issue and how that leads to conflicts. First, I wanted to share with you some of the most famous territorial types of disputes between countries in the world. So here we have the 38th parallel separating between North and South Korea, very famous area over the world, which led to a lot of tensions between countries. Here we have part of the border fence between Israel and the Gaza Strip. Again, led to a lot of conflicts over the time. And we also have here a part of the border wall between United States, and Mexico. So all those issues are highly known issues, and they are very much likely to be in the news regarding about the use of violence to address them. Okay, so I want to move the discussion when we talk about this territoriality aspect to what's called an issue-based approach, in which territory represents a major issue that affects the outcome for us, for our discussion, that is the probability of going into conflict. And that's based on the work by Hensel and his associates. They promote an issue-based approach to foreign policy. Mostly, they address different types of issues between states, which also includes territorial issues and other types, and they will assess how and whether those kinds of issues will lead to the adoption of different policy tools, whether the territorial issues will lead to the adoption of using force or using diplomatic solutions, and whether other political types of issues, other economic types of issues, and diplomatic issues will lead to the adoption of other policy tools. So from a definitional standpoint, an issue, according to their work, is a disputed point of question, or point or question. It is the subject of a conflict or of a controversy. So that's what an issue is. And what they promote here, as I said, is an issue-based approach. According to this approach, policymakers are concerned with achieving different goals over those specific issues. And they're not just simply pursuing such vague notions such as power or security. Politicians, what drives political decision makers, it's not this pursuit of power or security, which was one of the central arguments laid out by neorealism and realism. Instead, the issue-based approach says that foreign policy behavior is primarily dependent on the different objectives that political leaders have when it comes to specific issues. So when we think about the different types of issues that we have in the political world or in political sphere, there's large variation overall. One way to classify them is to tangible and intangible types of issues. So tangible issues revolve, for example, around security, safety from external threat. For example, secure our territory. That's one tangible issue. Wealth can be another tangible issue. That is the accumulation of resources and goods for the betterment of those that consume them. Survival, which is the provision of basic human needs. All of those kinds of issues are tangible issues that are part of political world. At the same time, we also have a lot of intangible issues. Those revolve around, or intangible values for those issues. That can be the cultural aspect of it, identity-related values, independence, influence, prestige, status, ideology. All those things are intangible values which can be associated with the different issues. Now, to address those different issues that we have, leaders can use a wide variety of pool of policy options that can involve negotiations of different level, diplomacy, using bilateral negotiations, mediation types of strategies. Another tool that can be used are different types of threats, economic threats. We talked about sanctions, military type threats. And the last one, which we are also talking about today, and we talked about a lot in previous lectures, is the use of force in order to address those kinds of issues, right? Now, the most critical concept when we talk about issues in foreign policy is the concept of salience or issue salience. And issue salience, this is the important issue, is more likely to garner more attention and to require more than a single policy tool to address it, right? The more important the issue is, it's going to require a lot more attention from the policymakers, from the public that thinks about that, right? And if issues had in the past led to conflict, or whether there was attempts to solve those types of issues in a peaceful manner and those attempts failed, also makes those issues more salient. Now, the degree of salience for issues can vary between different types of issues, of course. So that can be, first of all, we view that as the importance that is attached to an issue by the different actors which are involved, or to the extent that people and the leaders value an issue. That's the variation that can exist between different issues when it comes to salience. Now, to determine those, the way that people determine their determine the degree of salience that the issue represents for them depends on the values that they have in terms of physical survival, wealth, security, independence, status. So there's different values to different issues, as I said earlier, And this is what actually sets for individuals how important those issues are. So intuitively we can think about that some issues are more important than other issues because some people emphasize some values in their attitudes than others. So that affects the way that they view those different issues and how salient those issues are in their minds. Okay, so all that was just a kind of an introduction to the idea of an issue-based approach to foreign policy and the critical concept of issue salience, how that relates to us. For our purposes, we should think about the fact that territory may represent, or the argument in the research, in the literature is that territory represents a salient issue. Why is that? Mostly because it consists of a lot of resources that are essential for individual survival. And that led a lot of the earlier scholars to suggest that territorial issues are at the top of the list of the most salient issues that we have. Now, at the same time, we have to assess that and test the data and test the evidence we have about wars, whether issues like that were more important than others, because an equally important or an equal argument can be that issues that revolve around reputation or status, again, intangible values the territory has, are just as important as the tangible values of territory, right? So overall, when we think about this classification of tangible and intangible values of different territories, the tangible and intangible values of issues, territory has high values in both of those categories. From a tangible standpoint, territorial claims often revolve around lands, of course. Those lands have economic and strategic values, right? Wealth, physical security, those are all tangible values that are associated with a territorial issue. At the same time, territories also have an enormous intangible significance that can be part of the national identity, can be closely tied to values of independence, status, or prestige. So in both of those categories, whether those are tangible and intangible values, territories score relatively high. Now, as we said, salience, the degree of how salient the issue is critical in shaping the type of response we're going to have when there is competition over an issue. When there is competition over territory, how important that territory is to us will shape the way that we will respond to it. And the argument, the main argument that we can promote or we can talk about here is that when issue is very salient for countries, they will commit more resources and they will be open to bearing a lot higher cost in order to address those kinds of problems. So they are more likely to engage or to entertain riskier policy options, those that involve higher degree of cost. And this kind of argument suggests that when it comes to highly salient issues, a militarized solution is highly likely, right? So when territories represent highly salient issues, a violent military action is more likely to be the outcome in this case. That's the bottom line of their argument. And what you have here on your screen is kind of examples for territorial issues between different actors, which led to a violent solution. So the two gentlemen here on the sides of the screen are actually the same person. This is William Wallace, which was a Scottish individual which took a substantial part in leading the first war of Scottish independence from England back in the 13th century. So this is the original William Wallace, and that's Mr. Mel Gibson, which portrayed him in the famous movie. And in between, we have some historical photos from Israeli wars, which a lot of the wars that Israel was engaged in over its history revolve around territorial issues. Again, salient issues, which increase the odds that the way to address those issues will be using violent military action. Going back to the work by Hansel and his associates, what they do is they test a series of hypotheses using data about different conflicts and that revolve around different issues, trying to assess which one of them are most likely to be viewed as a contentious issues, which means which types of issues are more likely to trigger a conflict type solutions, and what others are more likely to trigger a peaceful type solutions. So overall, what did they find is that territorial issues are more likely to produce a militarized conflict than other types of issues. Other types of issues, for example, include maritime types of issues, other political issues, what's called river disputes, disputes over areas that involve some rivers. Overall, their likelihood of leading to a violent militarized solution is lower. Now, more in general, when we think about, as I said, about this issue-based approach for foreign policy, they find that the probability of a militarized conflict substantially will increase as the degree of salience of the issue will increase as well, regardless of the type of issue, whether it is territory or maritime. The more salient the issue, the more likely it is that the solution will be of a militarized conflict type. They find overall in their data, the baseline probability of going into militarized disputes is 0.01, which means one militarized dispute per 100 years. That's in their data. Okay, so it's not a lot because the data, while those data are very rich, overall in terms of the number of wars, we don't have a lot of wars throughout the history of the last 300, 400 years. Now, so the baseline probability of going into a militarized dispute is 0.01. However, they show that when they change the degree of issue salience from a lower level to the maximum level, then the probability of going into a militarized war increases by about 5 times. So again, the numbers, specific numbers are not that high, but it still represents that once the degree of salience of the issue increases, the probability of that issue turning into a militarized conflict also increases substantially. Okay, so we talked about the importance of issues in foreign policy overall, the importance of territorial issues as leading to conflict. And now I want to talk about the different factors which makes territorial disputes more likely to escalate into wars. And that's the work by Wright and Deal. We know that overall territorial issues increase the odds of countries going to wars. And what we want to focus a little bit more now is trying to understand what are those factors that makes certain territorial disputes more likely to escalate into a full-blown war. And the main argument or the main focus of the Wright and Deal paper is domestic institutions in the sense of regime type. So what exactly we're talking about when we're talking about domestic politics and territorial disputes? Repeated disputes over territory, when territory becomes a central dispute between countries, it shapes the domestic political debate, the domestic interactions between political actors. And those that present much more a hardline approach tend to accumulate more influence over the political process. And overall, they increase the odds that when the issue at stake is a territorial issue, the probability of going to war will be much higher. Now, in order to understand that, we can think about what Wright and Deal suggest in order to explain that dynamic, using what they call the outbidding argument. The idea behind outbidding are that there are internal debates between domestic actors in both rival states when it comes to territorial issues. And those internal debates comes when different actors provide different perspectives. And there's some actors which will outbid others in their arguments by promoting a more tougher approach. We should not compromise over territory, right? We should not allow territorial disputes to become something that we are allowing our rivals to get the better of us. Why? Because this is a high value issue. When I talked about the values of territory, I talked about the tangible and intangible values of territory. Those are very high value issues. So when this process takes place, it is very unlikely that politicians that aspire to remain in office will compromise, right? Because the entire domestic political debate around territory shifts into more of the hardline approach that we should not compromise over territory. So the leader is less likely to adopt this kind of an approach. As an example, there was a study conducted over internal debates in Northern Ireland at the time that the Irish has clashed with the British over the control of the British in Northern Ireland. And those studies have shown that there were leaders in the Irish, in the Northern Ireland side that gained substantial public support by presenting a very hardline approach, even before they entered to their leadership positions. Now, once those individuals have won their leadership positions, they were reluctant to back down from their hardline approach. And as a result, essentially, what they began when they were still just candidates for different positions in the Irish leadership, when they become the leaders, they were less likely to adopt a compromising type of approach. So again, a territory-based conflict was more likely because of that. And that's, again, this is an outcome that's based on this outbidding dynamics. Now, as we said, the main factor that they talk about when they discuss this process of escalation when it comes to territorial issues is based on domestic institutions, which leads us to talk about different regimes. So outbidding, according to their argument, should be much more powerful in democracies, and this can be explained based on the logic of selectorate theory. Leaders of democracies will try to frame the territorial issues as a public good, which will be beneficial to all citizens, right? Remember, when we talked about selectorate theory logic, leaders are providing public goods because they cannot provide private goods to all their supporters, all their winning coalition supporters, because there's a lot of people. So they will actually emphasize the intangible aspect of territory. Everybody can benefit from the, whatever it is, the status, the prestige of holding that territory. Everybody in the country will benefit from that, instead of looking at or focusing on the tangible aspect of territory. So the territory in a democracy, when it's framed like that, is much more important from a symbolic standpoint than from the tangible standpoint. Now, in those kinds of dynamics, leaders in democracies that consider to compromise over territorial issues face outbidding behavior by their rivals, right? That's going to emphasize the hardline approach. We should not compromise on those kinds of things. And because they are at risk of losing the support of their winning coalition, they're less likely to compromise. The bottom line of this point is that democracies, when they face territorial disputes, are more likely to bargain a lot harder and for much longer time over resolving that issue. And they're also more likely to accept the risk of escalating a territorial dispute into a war over territory, right? Now, keeping up with this, with the logic of selectorate theory and the different types of regimes and territories, for autocrats, private goods are the most important part in order to ensure their survival, right? They provide private goods to their small circle of supporters in order to ensure their survival. Now, when it comes to territory, that means that autocrats will actually emphasize the tangible value of territory, because those are actual resources that can be provided, can be distributed among the small circle of supporters for the dictator, which will ensure that the leader will remain in office. So outbidding in that context will take the form of elite competition for their own interest, rather than talking about support or any kind of benefits for the entire population. So, for example, part of the motivation for the Japanese aggression before World War II is explained by their need to take control over the islands in the Pacific in order to support their economy. So this is a very tangible aspect of the territory intended to provide private goods in that sense to the elite, which was in control in Japan at the time. Now, when two autocrats face a dispute over territory, the likelihood that they will go to war, they will escalate into a full-blown war, is much lower, because they are reluctant to take the risk and lose resources because of a conflict. So they would prefer that the solution will be a stalemate over that territory, and they will try to solve their dispute by focusing on other goods and not territory, right? In addition, the fact that audience cost represents a lower proposition when it comes to dictatorships, right? If a leader of a dictatorship issues some kind of threat regarding territory and then backs down from that threat, that leader is less likely to suffer substantial audience costs, right? So all that means that when two dictators face a territorial type of issue or dispute, they're less likely, it's easier for them to avoid from going to wars. Now, if we stay with the argument, reminding you again, that was offered by Wicks about unpacking autocracies, those that are leaders of a more personalist type regimes are actually more likely to go to wars, because territory for them represents that resources that they can provide to their small coalition, right? But leaders of other types of autocracies, leaders of party-based autocracies or leaders of military councils that are in the leadership role for autocracies, have relatively larger um, winning coalition, therefore it's less efficient for them to try and win control over territory and provide it as a private good because there's a larger coalition. So the work by Deal and Wright is based on analyzing dyads of regimes in disputes between 1816 and 2001, and they find what is the probability that territorial disputes or non-territorial disputes between different types of regimes will lead to war. We have here on the y-axis the probability of going to war, and here we have different types of dyads. So for example, two democracies which have a dispute over a non-territorial issues are almost have a 0% of actually going into war, which also fits with the democratic peace argument. Overall, we see that all three of these categories are non-territorial issues, and the probability of going into conflict is lower than the other types. We have here the joint autocracies, but primarily the mixed dyad regimes, which is a democracy and a non-democracy. In a dispute over territory, the probability they will go to war is substantially higher than all the others, right? Now, before we go into further breaking down this point, we can also look at the different types of autocratic regimes and when they face democracies in territorial disputes. We see here, especially comparing those three, the strongman, which is the personalist type dictator, facing a democracy over territorial issues, the probability of war is substantially higher than this boss type or the junta type, which are the other, the party type or the military council. So that provides additional support for their argument beforehand. Now, overall, so what we know from that research is that when a democracy and a non-democracy are engaged in dispute over territory, war is more likely because the bargaining space between them will decrease overall, primarily because democracies place a lot more value on winning a dispute in that sense, because territory is a public symbolic issue with intangible values. Autocrats, primarily the strongman type, the personalist leaders of autocracies, value the tangible aspect of of territories in the sense of resources. So all that makes conflict between those two types of regimes much more likely. Okay, now I want to shift to an even more of an individual level view and how these territorial issues are ingrained into that and how that leads to higher probabilities that territorial issues will go into a war. Now, to do that, we'll focus on the work by Thier, which talks a lot about the diversionary war theory. So before we go into some of those political motivations for individual motivations to view territory as a cause for war, I want to talk first about this diversionary war theory, which I've mentioned in previous lecture, but provide you a little bit more context, but this is important for that specific research. So according to diversionary war theory, wars in the international systems are not a result of the clash of conflicts between states. Instead, they're based on a domestic process. Domestic political concerns that leaders have will push them to generate or to highlight any types of foreign policy crisis with the objective of diverting public attentions from any kind of domestic problems that they face. For example, if there's an economic crisis, which is a domestic problem, so the leaders will want to divert the public attention from that crisis by highlighting an international crisis, and this international crisis might lead to war. That's the argument behind the diversionary war theory. It's also relevant for other types of political crisis or social unrest. Now, overall, the leaders gains from this diversion tactic. So by initiating this international type crisis, the leaders, for once, is able to shift public focus away from their own incompetence or their own domestic failures, and at the same time also generate support based on the rally around the flag effect. We have this external conflict which is a threat to all of us, so let's rally behind the leader and support the leader's actions against an external threat, and for a minute, for a month, for how long a period of time we want to, we will forget about the fact that we have a lot of problems at home, economic crisis, social unrest, whatever that may be. That's the idea behind that theory. Now, the main problem that the diversionary war theory faces is the mixed empirical evidence that supports it. I'm going to give you a couple of examples here which are actually provide some support for that. Former Bolivian President Morales has faced over the last 10 or so years growing protest at home from a lot of domestic political crises. And what he did in order to divert that public attention away from the domestic crisis is to spin a loss of coastline, which took place with a crisis with Chile, which was back in 1879. War of the Pacific was a crisis between was a war between Bolivia and Chile, and Bolivia lost part of its coastline to Chile at the time. And Morales has used those kinds of things in order to spin a potential crisis with Chile when he faced substantial domestic political problems. Another example is the emergence of dispute or escalation of dispute between Croatia and Slovenia. The closer the latter was to its elections in 2005 and 2008, elections also represents a potential domestic sensitive point in time because leaders are facing the potential of losing their positions, so they're maybe viewed as more at risk of their own survival. In that case, they're more likely to invoke this diversionary logic and shift the public away from the risk of their potentially losing the political support into the fact that we have an external threat. The South Korea and Japan has intensified their dispute over the Dokdo Island back in 2006, when the Korean leader, already facing dropping approval ratings, also had the prospect of upcoming election at the time. So that allowed that leader to highlight the external threat over the territory, over those islands, instead of thinking about the loss of approval back home. Now, all that is just background into the diversionary war theory. And how is that relevant to our discussion? According to the approach that's promoted by Thier, we can think about a territorial dispute as a diversionary point, right? A territorial diversion means that the leaders will invoke a crisis based on territorial issues, and that kind of crisis is more likely to trigger the dynamics that the public will be diverted away from any kind of domestic problems. So when the issue that we are using in order to promote this kind of diversionary logic, when the issue is a territorial issues, it's more likely to be successful. That's the point. And why is that? Territorial issues are more likely to trigger those in-group, out-group mechanism, which is so important in promoting higher degree of threat perceptions. That is, all of us here in Texas are facing the risk of Mexico invading. So we all have to come together and face this external risk. So the in-group, out-group mechanism is very strong in this case. Territorial disputes are also more likely to elicit greater emotional investment, mobilization of the public to support or to rally behind the leader when it comes to territorial issues, as well as stronger social bond, societal bond. And as an example for that, I want to focus on the Israeli decision in 2005 to disengage from the Gaza Strip. So I'll give you some background in this case. The Gaza Strip is this very small area of land which was under the Israeli control since the 1967 war, and populated by Israeli settlers. The strip is a tiny area, 25 miles long, about 5 miles wide. So the distance here between the eastern edge of the strip and the Mediterranean Sea is about 5 to 7 miles long. It housed about 2 million Palestinians a couple of years ago, which puts it as one of the top 3 most populated areas in the world in terms of density. A lot of people living in a very small area, and within this very substantial amount of Palestinians, there were Israeli settlers which lived in different areas. All those orange areas that you see here on your screen are the different settlements that were established way back in the early 1980s to have Israeli citizens sitting in that area. Now, in 2005, after a lot of debates and facing considerable national security threats to those individuals, the Israeli government has decided to hand over the control over the Gaza Strip back to the Palestinians and to disengage from that area, which means taking all the Israeli settlers from that area and relocating them to other places in Israel. Now, regardless of your political opinion, whether you think those areas should be held by Israel or not, and that's not the point of what I'm using this example, the summer of 2005 in Israel has been a very emotional and strong, in that sense, times, because those people were taken away from their land. They developed very strong emotional ties to the territories where they lived. So once they were removed from that, those have led to those kinds of very strong emotional responses. And that's the main point why I'm presenting this kind of case. Individuals tends to create very strong ties to the land where they live, regardless of political opinion. And removing that represents for them, makes the territory a very, very important issue for that. Now, thinking about all that, this kind of dynamics provides the leaders, when we go back to our discussion, this kind of a dynamic provides leaders with important advantages in making a territorial issue an important diversion for domestic problems. Okay? Now, using territory as the linchpin of the diversion logic also offers us some analytical benefits when it comes to research. For example, I talked about everything related to the strong ties that individuals tends to form when it comes to land. It's related to their identity, related to their culture, related to the nation. And as a result, because of those strong ties, it increases the motivations and the willingness of people to fight over land, which in some cases have almost no economic or strategic value. So going back to the example of the Gaza Strip, for Israel as a state, for the vast majority of the Israeli citizens, the Gaza Strip does not have substantial or almost any economic and strategic value, but it has a very strong, again, identity, cultural, national value. But the point is that people were willing to fight and to argue and to go into disputes over handing over that territory back to the Palestinians. Again, all that suggests that territorial issues and the pursuit of territory is more than just the rational calculating behavior. It's beyond that. Another analytical point of view or advantage that we can gain from that is that if we use if we want to test this diversionary logic and we focus on territorial issues in that case, that allows us to apply the logic of the diversionary war theory beyond the American case. In most cases, the diversionary war theory has been tested or was more fitting to powerful states and the way that they behave facing domestic problems. Right? It's easier for powerful states to project their powers outwards when they face domestic problems and rally the public. Now, if we're shifting away from that and we're using territory as the main motivations to create diversion, that allow us to test that in a lot more context. So for that case, both the leaders of Israel or the leaders of the Palestinians can use a territorial argument in order to create that diversion from any kind of domestic problems they have and to rally the public behind them and to generate support. Talking a little bit more about the individual standpoint. So as we said, the strong ties that are created to the land also lead to very strong emotional investment in that. And that means that territory for some people, especially for individuals, becomes an integral part of their identity. And also if we're aggregating that for a group of people, that's part of ingrained in the national psyche. More specifically, for the psychological underpinnings of the strong connections that individuals have with territory, we can think about the way that those strong bonds with territory makes individuals perceive territory or perceive land as a zero-sum competition, which means that it is an indivisible area. Either I have all the territory or I have nothing. It's impossible to compromise in that case, or improbable to compromise. And the only way to secure the control or to obtain control of a territory is by using force. Again, all that is the process means that we have strong ties to the land. We have strong emotional investment. We view that in a zero-sum competition. So we have to use force to ensure that we have the control over the land. We can also think about it from the concept of, from the angle of prospect theory. A territory in that context will become the reference point to judge the current situation we face, right? And if we lost that territory, then we are actually in the domain of loss, again, in the terminology of prospect theory. And when we are in the domain of loss based on prospect theory, the behavioral outcome in that is accepting a much more risk-taking behavior. We can think about some of the famous stories about battles during the Vietnam War when the American forces have lost control on some base, on some kind of area that they were holding control, and they fought very hard to regain control over that because they were in the domain of loss, staying with the prospect theory logic. And the number of people that have died because of those strong ties to the territory, again, here this is based in the argument that I'm proposing here, based mostly on psychological mechanisms such as the domain of loss and risk-taking. Okay, before we conclude with the work by Tier, I'll stop for today's attendance word, and that's going to be relevant for our discussion. The attendance word for today will be the word land. Land will be the attendance word for today. Okay, so all the discussion that I've talked about, that I've presented so far, suggest that when it comes to territorial issues, leaders can manipulate the public views of those leaders by invoking territorial issues and generating a diversion type conflict. And the end result, which is what the leaders hope to get, is by using this kind of diversion, territorial diversion, they will increase the public support for them, and the public will rally behind the leader and kind of forget on some level from the domestic problems. However, facing a conflict, right, war or limited types war, especially ones that revolve around territory, has potential for substantial amount of cost. So a prolonged war involve accumulating number of costs, and those costs may outweigh the potential benefits that the leader got from just invoking the diversion based around the territory and getting the benefits of that. So if the war persists over time, the cost on the war will be higher than the potential benefits that this whole thing was began with. In addition, rally effects are not automatic; they're not guaranteed, and primarily they are short-lived. That's what a lot of the research has shown us, that they are short-lived phenomena. So that relates also to the first point that I have here. Maybe you will be able to generate some rally effect early on, but if the war persists over time, the costs are just going to outweigh any type of benefits. And finally, it is possible that after the war, some of members of the public will blame the leader for initiating an unnecessary conflict when the motivation for the leader was just to divert public attention away from domestic problems. Now the leaders also decided to engage in an unnecessary conflict. So there's going to be even growing number of criticism on the leader. So if you remember when I talked about audience cost, I mentioned this belligerence cost aspect, that some people are opposing the use of force in the international system because it does not fit to their attitude. So some people will oppose the idea of going into conflict, especially if when it comes to going to conflict in order to divert attention away from all kinds of domestic problems. So what the author does in this paper is to use data on militarized disputes, especially territorial types of issues, and see how much does those types of issues represent a diversionary types of mechanism. And what he finds is that leaders that face low popularity, leaders that face low degrees of popularity, so leaders that face substantial domestic problems, are more likely to increase their reliance on territorial issues as a diversionary mechanism and go into conflict. So when there are domestic problems, leaders will invoke those kinds of territorial issues and turn them into a conflict. And that's going to be useful for them, just like the theory supports. Now, in terms of different types of domestic problems, so economic crisis is less of a powerful motivations for diversion based on territory compared to other types of domestic political problems, such as social unrest. And finally, he accounts both for diversion factors, right, the low popularity of the leader, as well as strategic indicators, and he assesses the individual effect of each one of those different factors, and he shows that overall the diversionary factors have an effect on the probability of going into conflict over territory. However, the strategic indicators such as the power and the distance are a lot more powerful, right? So the diversion logic based on a territorial issue is part of the explanation of why states will go to war, but it's only part of the explanation and a relatively smaller part compared, based on the data that he had, compared to the strategic incentives of going to conflicts over territory. Okay, if you want to read more, then I highly recommend those papers. I hope you enjoyed today's show. I tried to give you a good job. And we'll keep talking about territorial issues later this week. Reminding you again, I'll send you the third quiz later today. make sure that you read the papers for next week for the terrorism and answer the questions and submit it to me by next Sunday. With that, I will sign off and we'll see you Wednesday. Bye, everyone.